In dealing with the development of destroyers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, we should recognize that until 1868, Japan was a country of fiefdoms ruled by largely independent feudal lords. This system was abolished when the country as a whole perceived it needed to unite under a single and imperial government. At this time, this newborn state had no effective navy to speak of other than a motley collection of small vessels for coastal defense. With the creeping expansion of major powers, the United States of America and Russia, for example, into what we refer to as the Far East, and the advancing interests of other predatory states, it became clear to Japan's government that if the country was to survive annexation, it would only do so if it were to build up an effective navy capable of resisting these advances. With limited resources, it is not surprising that the embryo Japanese naval staff took a long look at the concepts of the French Jeune École, which we discussed some time ago, and its concept of using small, fast warships armed with the Whitehead torpedo to attack enemy main force units. This led to the French becoming one of their main providers of torpedo boats, along with Britain and Germany. With little knowledge of large-scale shipbuilding practice, the Japanese inevitably decided to seek advice from Western navies and eventually opted to model their navy and its methods of operation on that of the British Royal Navy. They realized they had to acquire some major ships to form at least a small battle fleet, but they also concentrated their attention on small, fast warships armed with torpedoes. These they bought from commercial yards in Britain, Thornycroft and Yarrow, from France, Normande, and from Germany, Seychelles. Now, we do not need to concern ourselves with these for today, but when the British started to produce, at a prodigious rate, a vessel capable of catching and destroying the torpedo boat destroyer, or TBD as I shall call them, Japan, as part of its 10-year naval expansion plan, placed orders with Thornycroft and Yarrow for 14 of these craft. They were followed by 9 built in Japan along British lines, and this expansion started in 1898, and the program was for 6 of the Murakumo class by Thornycroft in 1898, 8 of the Ikazuchi class by Yarrow in 1899, 2 the Shirakumo class built in Japanese yards in 1901, and 2 the Akatsuki class built in Japanese yards in 1901. Now, both of these last 2 were built with considerable British influence in their design and equipment. Most of these craft were available for the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, and during that war, much was learnt about their use and deployment. The battles during the Sino and Russo-Japanese wars were fought in relatively enclosed or coastal waters and not in open wild water like the North Sea. This led to a rather different use of its TBDs by Japan, in contrast to the fleet role envisaged for them by the British Royal Navy. Although it was to change, the Royal Navy saw its TBDs as forming a defensive screen against enemy attacking torpedo craft, whereas the Japanese used them independently for torpedo and towed mine attack against the enemy's main fleet units using stealth and operating under the cover of darkness. Now, I want to run through a short comparison exercise between the development of the Royal Navy's destroyer program and that of the Imperial Japanese Navy between 1901 and 1918. I choose these dates because 1901 was the date when Japan started building her own warships. Of course, not surprisingly, there were many similarities, given that up until this date, Japan was basically buying British. Besides which, in 1902, Britain and Japan signed a naval treaty, which resulted in, amongst other arrangements, Japan supplying a destroyer flotilla to support the Royal Navy operations in the Mediterranean during World War I. In fact, during this war, Great Britain continued to build and to supply destroyers for the Imperial Japanese Navy. But before I do this, I should mention that the Japanese decided, in about 1910, to classify their destroyers into three classes. The third class, under 600 tons displacement, and in fact, effectively a TBD. The second class, above 600 and under 1,000 tons displacement. And the first class, above 1,000 tons displacement. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, did not use this rather arbitrary measure of displacement, but relegated their TBDs and other early destroyers to coastal duty such as channel operations, and in fact the Mediterranean, whilst also regarding more seaworthy destroyers as fleet destroyers and providing these with larger and more powerful destroyer leaders for direction and fire support. In broad terms, Japan built only third-class destroyers, TBDs, until 1909, before constructing two first-class destroyers capable of oceanic operations. Thereafter, the bulk of production was of second-class destroyers, similar in many ways, including displacement and armament, to the Royal Naval destroyers built before 1911. Thereafter, Japanese destroyers had a slightly lighter displacement than their British wartime M, R and S class ships. I will start with the Harusami class, brought into commission in 1903. 7 of these TBDs were built by Japan using an amalgamation of British designs and presented a bow and forebody like a Yarrow TBD and an after hull like that of a Thornycroft model. They had the by then well-established armament of one 12-pounder quick-firing 1200-weight gun and 4 6-pounder quick-firing guns, but replaced the normal 5th 6-pounder gun with a 12-pounder quick-firing 800-weight gun. They also carried the normal 2 18-inch single torpedo tube launchers. Now, this class and its predecessors all saw service in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, and from them much was learned about the required design and methods of operation of torpedo craft. The doctrine of engaging by torpedo from long range was proved not to work with a low strike rate, but on the plus side, the damage wrought on the fleeing Russian battle fleet following the Battle of Tsushima by TBDs was considerable and was achieved not only by torpedo attack, but by dragging necklaces of mines across the paths of enemy ships. This harks back to the idea of the towed torpedo of the late 1800s. The next production, starting in 1904, was to be a very large class of 32 vessels, in many ways similar to the Royal Naval River class, except that they stuck with a turtleback foredeck, possibly because they were not faced with the rigours of the North Sea or indeed the Mediterranean at this time. They also retained the 4 smokestack arrangement of the earlier TBDs. Now, these ships were much lighter than the River class at 381 tons compared to 550 for the Rivers, and also slightly shorter at 227 feet to 231 feet. Thus, they were faster than the Rivers at 29 as opposed to 25 knots. Japanese had by now dispensed with a 6-pounder gun, so these destroyers now had an all 12-pounder armament. The torpedo arrangement remained the same as it did for the Rivers at 2 18-inch torpedo tubes. Whilst all of the Harusumi-class TBDs were available for the Russo-Japanese War, only 2 of this class were involved in the battles. Now, Japan's next production, which did not occur until 1911, was a substantial step up in scale to the first class, capable of oceanic deployment, and for that they had fully raised foredeck. They were, in fact, modelled on the Royal Navy's Tribal class 1905 to 1908, and like them were fast, being equipped with 3 direct drive turbines, giving them a speed of 33 knots, against the Tribal's 35. They were well armed with 2 4.7-inch breech-loading guns and 5 12-pounder quick-firing guns, plus the obligatory 2 18-inch torpedo tubes. The Tribals had retained the all 12 12-pounder quick-firing battery. There was a school of thought in Royal Naval circles that in a small warship and a choppy seaway, there was a lot to be said for a quick-firing gun, albeit at a lower caliber than might be desirable. It was a case of the weight of fire rather than the weight of the single shell. Also in 1911, the Japanese completed two Sakura second-class destroyers, broadly similar to the British Acheron class, also of 1911. However, they were very much lighter at 530 tons as opposed to 745. Also, they were driven by vertical triple expansion engines, giving them a speed of 30 knots, as opposed to the Acherons, who managed 35, but these were driven by turbines. Again, their armament was more powerful than the British equivalent, in that they carried one 4.7-inch gun, breech loading, four 12-pounders, and two twin 18-inch torpedo tubes, where the Acherons were equipped with two 4-inch breech-loading guns and two 12-pounder quick-firing guns. We're beginning to see signs now of the Japanese trend to use more powerful armament on their destroyers than the British, but they were behind in propulsion and speed using vertical triple expansion engines rather than turbines, and they had light displacement. These latter two they would soon correct in the interwar period. The main wartime build for Japan was the Kaba-class destroyer, ordered in 1914 and launched starting in 1915. 22 were built, 12 of which were for the French Navy. Again, the class were fitted with vertical triple expansion engines and achieved 30 knots, as opposed to 35 knots that could be managed at the same time by the Royal Navy's M-class destroyer of the same date. The M-class also had a greater displacement of 900 tons as opposed to 655 for the Kaba class. Armament was similar, but of a different mix, with the Kaba having one 4.7-inch breech-loading gun and four 12-pounder quick-firing guns, whilst the M-class had three 4-inch guns, quick-firing, so presenting the greater weight of fire, if not the bigger 4.7-inch shell. Both carried twin torpedo tubes, but the British ship carried the 21-inch version, whilst the Japanese remained with 18. The Japanese Umakaze class of 1911 had not been a success. Not surprising, as it was modelled on the unfortunate British tribal design, so they needed more ocean-going destroyers and had ordered two, the Urakaze class, to be built by Yarrow. Due to other pressing orders, these were not completed until the end of the war, when one was delivered to Italy and just one to Japan. In 1916, Japan completed four Momo-class destroyers and four Izokaze class. The latter we will deal with in a moment. The Momo class was a scaled-down version of the simultaneously constructed Izokaze class and presented some of the features of her larger cousin, namely a convex as opposed to the previous straight bow profile, triple torpedo tubes, but still at 18 inches, geared turbines, and a single caliber armament of three quick-firing 4.7-inch guns, whereas the British retained a 4-inch battery of 3-inch quick-firing guns. The British equivalent of the R-class was a larger and faster vessel, 1,173 tons compared to the Japanese 835, and achieved 36 knots as opposed to 31.5. The R-class still had twin torpedo launchers, but it carried the 21-inch weapon. The Izokaze class is more comparable to the British V-class ships. These vessels had a slightly larger displacement than the V-class destroyers, coming in at 1,227 tons as opposed to 1,090. They had three shafts driven by three geared turbines, whilst the V-class had two shafts from twin turbines. Both vessels could steam at 34 knots, and both were the same length. The Japanese vessel was more powerfully armed. Both had a 4-gun main battery, but the Japanese was made up of 4.7-inch weapons, and the British 4-inch weapons. Both sets were quick-firing. Both were equipped with two sets of launchers, for 21-inch torpedoes. The British were twins, later increased to triples. The Japanese were triples at the outset. Again, we get a taste of the future, and the Japanese were tending to give their destroyers a more powerful armament than their British counterparts, albeit with just 4 classes to judge by. However, this view is backed up by the emergence of a new class right at the end of World War I, Kawasaki class. Only 2 were built, but they were powerful destroyers, more on the scale of British destroyer leaders of the time, the Shakespeare class. These latter displaced 1,554 tons, depending on the builder, whilst the Kawasaki was 1,300 tons. The LOAs were similar, 329 for the British destroyer and 319 for the Japanese. Both were driven by 2 shafts using 2 geared steam turbines. Also, speeds were close, with the Shakespeare achieving 36 and the Kawasaki's 37.5 knots. Both had the same caliber of main armament, 4.7 inches, but the British destroyer mounted 5, whilst the Japanese had only 3. In addition, the Shakespeare class had a 3-inch high-altitude quick-firing gun, whereas the Kawasaki only air defense weapons were 2 6.5mm machine guns. Both had 2 sets of triple 21-inch torpedo tubes. The last destroyers completed during World War I were the Inoki-class vessels, and somewhat akin to the Royal Navy's S&T class destroyers. They were considerably lighter at 850 tons, whilst an S-class came in at 1,075. Their LOAs were near to identical, with the former at 281 and the latter at 276 feet. However, whilst both were driven through 2 shafts using geared turbines, the British ship was far faster at 36 knots, compared to 31.5. But once again, the Japanese fitted 3 4.7 quick-firing guns and the British 3 4-inch. Moreover, the torpedo fit in the Japanese ship was 2 sets of 3 launchers, and the S&T class only sported 2 sets of twin tubes. Both used a 21-inch weapon. So in general, as the war progressed, Japanese destroyers seemed to have been given heavier armament, though they were less well developed to cope with attack from the air. They were not as fast as British destroyers, and to start with, they stuck with vertical expansion engines. The supply and manufacture of boilers and machinery may have caused difficulties. Also, apart from what the Japanese ruled as first-class destroyers, they were generally lighter than their British equivalents. They were also late in updating to the 21-inch torpedo. They never designed an arrangement for super-firing guns until later, and were wedded to the very short forecastle deck. World War I was inevitably a valuable experience for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and between the wars their destroyers developed into very powerful units, with a displacement in the region of 2,500 tons, and in particular in regard to guns, where some of them mounted 3 twin-barrel turrets with 5-inch guns. They also developed a larger 24-inch torpedo launched from 2 sets of quadruple tubes, but they were not so well equipped initially with the air defense guns and anti-submarine equipment. This was unfortunate for them because it was with those weapons that the United States Navy decided to attack them. Thank you.